I love Rumford baking powder. Of course, the question is, why? All right, let's go back historically. First, we're going to make a stop back in 1802 with the publication of this epic book. It was written by Benjamin Thompson. And as you can see, it's sort of philosophical about all kinds of things, but there are chapters in here about food. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Benjamin Thompson, who eventually became Count Rumford. He was born in the U.S. Before the American Revolution, but he was a loyalist. He sympathized with the British. Not very good for his health at that time. And when the revolution came around, he had to flee beyond the British lines. He was welcome there because he was already a scientist, and he knew about gunpowder, and the British were very happy to have him experiment with making gunpowder better. After the revolution, he moved to England, where he became chief scientist to King George III. Unfortunately, he also sold some naval secrets to the French. The king didn't like that. So instead of being punished because he still liked his science, he was given the chance of going to Bavaria as a diplomat and to act as a spy. Well, as soon as Thompson got to Bavaria, he severed all relationships with England, and he became a scientist to the Duke of Bavaria, who ruled at that time. And there was a lot of poverty in Bavaria at that time. And Thompson was charged with doing something about this. And he came up with the idea of workhouses, where the poor would work for a low salary. And this was good for everyone because they produced many, many items at a low cost. And at least they had some money as well. It was good for the state. It was good for the poor people. But they had to be fed. So how to feed them? He knew something about nutrition, and he came up with something that eventually came to be called Rumford soup. It was made of peas and barley, stuff that at the time were supposed to be nutritious, and they were also cheap. He also put potatoes in there, and he developed a system for drying potatoes. He had a machine that dried potatoes, and this is where the most interesting discovery was made, because he one day decided to try to cook some mutton in this machine that he had developed to dry potatoes. And it didn't work. He waited a couple of hours, the meat wasn't done, and he left it to the maids who looked after the kitchen. Well, they came back the next morning, and they found that the meat had been cooked properly, even though they had turned off the fire under this machine, but it had held enough heat so that at low temperature, it cooked this mutton perfectly. This gave birth, believe it or not, to the whole science of low-temperature cooking, which in the 1960s was invigorated when chefs discovered so-called vacuum packing. And low-temperature cooking, together with vacuum packing, gave birth to something that we call sous-vide cooking. Sous-vide actually in French means under vacuum, but it turns out it doesn't really have to be under vacuum. All right, so what do we mean by sous-vide cooking? You take plastic bag, and these days you can get plastic bags that are made especially for this, and you take your meat or vegetables and put it in there, and you don't need vacuum. You just squeeze out all the air and then seal it, and you immerse it in water. But the trick is that you cook it at a temperature way below the boiling point, because what Thompson found, that low temperature cooking saves fuel, obviously, but also gave a better flavor, texture to the meat. The only problem with it was that the meat did not become brown. So what do you do these days? You cook it sous vide, and then you sear it very quickly at the end. And this is, of course, what is done by many, many highly regarded chefs today. All right, well, back to my baking powder here. Rumford, Count Rumford, he took the name Rumford because of the town where he had grown up in the U.S. It was in New Hampshire, and he became Count Rumford because the Bavarian Duke appreciated his science and made him into a duke, and he chose the name, a count, and he chose the name Rumford. He died a rich man, and he left a lot of money to Harvard University to establish a professorship in his name, the Rumford Professorship. And in the 1800s, this professorship was given to a scientist by the name of Ibn Hartford, who developed baking powder, monocalcium phosphate mixed with sodium bicarbonate, and a little bit of starch in there to make sure that it did not absorb any moisture until it was ready to be used. This was a big, big breakthrough. And he decided, in homage to his benefactor, he named it Rumford baking powder. And so it is today. So when I ever bake something, rest assured it is always with Rumford baking powder, because Rumford did something else as well. He, together with Sir Joseph Banks, established the Royal Institute in London, which was given the task of publicizing science. And the lectures that were given every Friday night, people came from all over London and commemorated in this classic painting by James Gilray, where Humphrey Davy, who was the first lecturer selected by Joseph Banks and by Rumford, brought in the crowds. And here he was demonstrating nitrous oxide, laughing gas as we know it. And people came, laughed, and learned some chemistry. Obviously, I favor the public lecture. I've done many, many of them. And I'm always reminded of Rumford when I do it. And I use Rumford baking powder.